So, you want to pull an engine. So many wires, so many hoses. How do you do this? We're gonna tackle that today on this L28 and this Datsun 280Z. It's an older engine, so it's a little less complicated than a modern one, but still the principles are the same. We're gonna disconnect all the wiring harnesses. We're gonna drain all the fluids in the engine and the transmission, deal with the shifter on the inside. We're gonna pull the radiator out and anything else that can get in the way. It goes without saying though, if you're gonna swap this in with the same motor or you're just rebuilding what's in there, you need to be really careful about how you're marking things, taking pictures along the way on how cables and hoses are routed. But if you're going for an engine swap, probably like this guy, then you can kind of be a little more haphazard about how you're pulling it out. But first, let's drain all these fluids so we make the minimal amount of mess as possible. Before you start taking things apart, if you have refrigerant in your AC system, now is the time to take it to a shop and have them remove it. That stuff is nasty and you don't want it spraying in your face or all over your garage. I start with the coolant in the radiator. I had the jack already set up so you can see I lifted the rear of the car up for a minute to get as much coolant out as possible. Then I drain the engine oil. Then the transmission fluid, which seems to be a commonly forgotten one. If you pull the trans without draining the fluid, it'll end up all over the garage floor. You can check the magnetic plug for metal shavings. Mine looked pretty good.
There's some things that you literally physically cannot do by yourself. Show me a guy who can take an entire hood off by themselves, and I will hire him to do this next time.
Let's give it a shot. Yep, I give up already. Just kidding. Obviously this hood is a little different in that it's mounted in the front. I start by loosening all 4 of the bolts that hold the hood to the hinge. I unbolted one side of the hood, holding its weight up while I was wrenching. 1 screw. All right, 2 out. Okay, all right. It's holding up on its own. All right, I got an idea. Then I used an Allen key to hold it in place on that side and moved to the other side, where I held the hood up and supported it with my leg to stop it from sliding forward. And I'm pulling it up. All right, last bolt's out. A little finesse to get the Allen key out. Oh shit. Now I'm attached still. And a little shake to get the prop rod loose. We got it. Oh my God. Yeah, that's not good to do on your own. Was it easy? No, but I did it. So James, hopefully I didn't mess these threads up too much with that method, but they look all right. As you'll see, I'm constantly rethreading bolts back into their parts so I don't lose them. Personally, I like this better than labeling because I don't have to bust out a pen or a marker, and I don't have to worry about spilling a tray of bolts or trying to remember what I was attempting to describe. I won't show me doing this in the rest of the video, but pretty much every bolt or nut I took off, I threaded back on. If it's something that can be reassembled, I reassembled it. Now I'm going to focus on probably the grill area, the radiator, and the condenser for the air conditioner. To get some more room around the radiator, I start removing the intake system and the airflow meter. This is the airflow meter. It was clearly replaced. This thing looks brand new. Just had to disconnect this cable on the bottom. My fan shroud is broken, so I clip the zip ties holding it up and undo a couple screws to separate the top and bottom pieces. Then I feed them through the bottom, and then I take off the clutch fan. I did it this way in case there was some coolant in the upper radiator hose when I took it off, so it didn't go all over the fan shroud and everywhere. But predictably, there wasn't any coolant up there, but better safe than sorry. Then the lower radiator hose, which obviously did have some fluid in it. Now I start unbolting the brackets that hold the radiator and pull it out. I knew my Datsun's AC system was bone dry and not pressurized, so here I start working on the condenser. There's some heavy duty fittings on the AC lines that were kind of a pain to loosen. Larger wrenches would have helped, but I just used PB Blaster, a locking crescent wrench, and vice grips. With all the lines off, the AC condenser comes right out. Now I continue taking apart the front end. Often the engine hoist needs to be slid back as far as possible, especially with the S30 having such a long engine bay. So removing anything in the front of the car to allow the hoist closer to the engine will make things easier. Otherwise, you'll end up pulling the engine at an angle, and that'll force the hoist into the front bumper. Then it's just a couple remaining pieces of the air dam, and we made a ton of room in the front of the car for the engine hoist. All right guys, it is day 2, or really day 1.5, because yesterday was like 5 hours. Today I'm gonna make sure I get this last little bar here so we can get the engine hoist all the way in. Then I'm gonna focus on the engine bay a lot. Then there's also the drive shaft to drop, the clutch slave cylinder on the transmission, and disconnecting the shifter from the inside. It's a long list, but let's just get to it. These tension bars that help you lift the hood up were not my favorite thing to take apart, and you'll see why. As the name implies, they are definitely under tension. I removed the tensioner from one side, so I figured I was good to unbolt that side. But you'll see I was very wrong in 3, 2, 1. Yeah, that was scary. I clearly should have undone the other tension rod before undoing any of these bolts. Whoops. Now that I've escaped having a tension rod in my face and changed my pants, I can take out the hood hinges. Now to the intimidating engine bay, starting off with removing the battery. The battery tray is a common rust spot on this car, but luckily what you see here is what I'd call surface rust. None of the metal seems compromised, which is great news. Next I start working on anything that can get in the way of pulling the engine out, roughly working from the battery bay around the front of the engine and to the other side. Aside from the obvious electrical connectors, there's AC lines, vacuum hoses, coolant lines, fuel lines, all that needs to get pulled off and put out of the way. The inlet hose into the fuel filter felt welded on there, so I used a razor blade to make a relief cut into the hose. And of course, this is the hose that has the most fuel pouring out of it. That fuel filter held a lot more fuel than I thought. For the wiring, I mark everything I can. The Datsun uses pretty much 1 or 2 styles of connectors, so it's very easy to mix them up if they aren't labeled. Most cars will have a throttle cable or an electrical wire that can be disconnected at the throttle body. The Datsun has a linkage with these plastic ball sockets that can be popped off with some encouragement. Once I got all these wires disconnected, I wanted to keep them bundled so they're less likely to snag on things, so I just zip tied them up and dangled them out of the car. Got 3 bolts holding the exhaust to the exhaust manifold. And as I thought, these exhaust manifold nuts were seized and rusted on there pretty bad. Here's my setup for applying a crap ton of torque to these exhaust bolts. A breaker bar and a metal tube for my jack. Wow, that's a shear bolt. Yep, the first nut I tried to take off completely sheared the bolt. It's quite a bit of torque. To give myself an easier time with the other bolts, I take a wire brush and a second round of PB Blaster to attempt to clean up the rust on some of those exposed threads. These nuts were taking a lot of torque.
Oh no.
This does not sound good.
Be quiet, bolt.
Even with the nuts off, the exhaust isn't loose because of decades of rust, grime, and heat. It's basically welded on. So right here is where the exhaust meets the exhaust manifold. So I'm gonna do some hammering and spray a bunch of PV Blaster on it and see if I can get it loose. This car basically has a giant single piece exhaust and I won't be using it. So I'm just gonna drop the whole thing, which has 3 more hangers that are pretty easy to remove. So we got our clutch slave cylinder here. We're just gonna disconnect it with these 2 bolts. Probably leave it plumbed in for now and deal with the fluid later. This looks pretty new actually. I think this is the sensor for the reverse. Here's the speed sensor going to the transmission. I recommend taking it out this way because if you remove the bolt, you'll have this giant hole in the side of your transmission and a weird sensor you won't know what to do with. And this will leak some fluid. More oil? Where did that come from? Gotta love analog. This plumbing goes all the way to the engine bay, then through the firewall and into the speedo, I think. And the drive shafts, I'm actually missing a wrench that I need to get the drive shaft loose. And what the hell is this, Husky? You give me some metric wrenches and you give me a 13 mil, 14, 15, and a 17? Come on. Anybody who's worked on cars knows that I need the even ones. What the heck is a 15 mil for? Time to get some new ones, I guess. So that is it for day 1.5 to 2.5. Got a lot done today. We're almost ready to pull the engine. Let's clean up. So that's it for part 1. Most of the prep work is done, and all that remains is the drive shaft, the shifter linkage, and the mounts. We'll tackle those items and get this thing fully out in part 2. Thanks for watching, y'all, and don't forget to subscribe to follow this build.